And we're back on Consumer Choice Radio, coming to you on Sauga 960 AM and the Big Talker. Very excited for our guest this week to talk all things Conservative Party leadership race. We have Michael Diamond, the principal of Upstream Group, and a veteran of leadership campaigns himself. And so, Michael, thank you very much for joining us on Consumer Choice Radio.
Thanks for having me.
So, right off the bat, let's go back to the ousting of Aaron O'Toole. Not necessarily a common occurrence in Canadian politics. It's quite rare. It has happened before, but it is quite rare. Why do you think there was such pushback against O'Toole?
Well, and I think it's actually a good point to make how uncommon this is. In fact, the way Mr. O'Toole was removed as leader of a political party in Canada is unprecedented in modern times in Canada. In other similar democracies, the United Kingdom and Australia, namely, this sort of practice of a parliamentary caucus ousting the leader of a political party is fairly common. I mean, we've seen it in the last decade and a half in Australia, where it's like political hot potato tossing between past and former leaders and current leaders, and vice versa. But it's never happened in Canada, and it was a rather new thing. In 2015, the Parliament of Canada passed a piece of legislation called the Reform Act, which empowered members of Parliament to petition the chair of their caucus to have a vote on the leader of the party. And that provision's never been used to deal with the leader of a party until last week with Mr. O'Toole. So it was quite unprecedented, and it really, I think, took a lot of courage by the parliamentarians who petitioned, because political leaders in Canada have basically unparalleled amount of power within their political party to expel people from the caucus. That's been a little bit impacted by the Reform Act, to expel people from being members of their party, to expel people from being potential or future candidates from the party. Any candidate requires a signature from the leader of their political party. So the leader has a lot of power. So it required a minimum of 25 members of the caucus, and they actually got over 30 to sign a letter to have the vote. And then two-thirds, although it only required a simple majority, it was closer to two-thirds who voted to toss Mr. O'Toole from leader. So completely unprecedented. And I think, why did this happen? It was drip, drip, drip of factors. Mr. O'Toole's team wanted to blame. They called it the angry Shearites, blaming supporters of the previous leader. That might have been a factor, but it was only one factor. Because if you look back to right after the election, Mr. Scheer had a lot of confidence still within the caucus. People were publicly supporting him. There was definitely ridicule against those within the party, both parliamentary caucus and activist class, who were questioning his ability to stay on his leadership. But then when he refused to change, he refused to admit that the previous election was a failure, which it was. He got fewer votes and fewer seats than his predecessor and failed to form government. He failed to reverse course on some of the policy changes he made, namely support for a carbon tax, which was very offside with both the caucus and the membership. And when he refused to change his ways, I think caucus expected that. After a election defeat, there has to be time for reflection. And if a leader is going to stay, they have to, I think, demonstrate how they'll do things differently in order to win. Mr. O'Toole failed to do that, which motivated his caucus to take action.
Hmm. Wow. Well, Michael, thank you for that, and also thank you for those bright yellow colors you're wearing, which those listening won't be able to, but we'll see if we can do with the video. So the question that I have on that is, from what I've seen from sort of the inner circle of journalists working in the nation's capital, up there in Ottawa, there is a lot of connection to what's happening with the trucker convoy, and the idea that this is some kind of perilous time for democracy. And at that exact moment, the Conservative Party is seemingly falling apart, or having, sort of shifting of the chairs. How relevant do you think that kind of commentary is? Do you think it has anything to do with it? Do you think it's just an opportune time, or is it just sort of a happy accident that all of this is happening at the exact same moment?
Look, I think that analysis, which I've certainly read, is complete and utter codswallop from a group of journalists who don't really understand the inner workings of the Conservative Party. The effort to dump Mr. O'Toole much predates the arrival of the convoy in Ottawa. In fact, it's my understanding that the letter was signed before the convoy showed up. In any other circumstance, if it was another party, the Parliamentary Press Gallery would be talking about how wonderful it was that the caucus stood up for democracy and the rights of parliamentarians by ousting the leader. But there's always a different set of rules for a Conservative Party in this country, where media will be a bit more negative. And furthermore, Mr. O'Toole, as a social liberal, was the type of conservative who the press gallery and small L liberals at cocktail parties in the nation's capital would say to them, if all conservatives were like you, we'd actually, we'd consider maybe voting possibly in the future for the Conservative Party. So he was popular amongst those who were never going to vote for us. And I think they'll use anything to try and make his ouster look like an alt-right radical fringe element within the party. It's simply not true.
So on that note, one of the criticisms of the ousting of O'Toole from some, and I'm wondering if you think that this carries weight, is that the ones who are really leading the charge are, generally speaking, Conservative MPs who are in forever seats. It does not matter, and therefore they are maybe disconnected from the tone and approach that is needed to win a general election. So I'm curious as to what your take on that is, because that was one of the counter arguments to the ousting of O'Toole.
I mean, I'd say the problem with that analysis is that under Mr. O'Toole's leadership, all the parliamentary caucus was left with essentially was the quote unquote forever seats. We got fewer seats than we did in the previous election. In the history of the Conservative Party of Canada, there's only been 2 elections where we ended up with fewer seats after the previous after election day than the previous one. It was 2015 when under Stephen Harper we lost government after over a decade in the halls of power, and after this last election where we weren't in government. There's very few seats left for us to lose. So I mean, I don't think that's actually fair. We don't know who signed the letter. I have a pretty good idea. I think most commentators who are paying attention have a pretty good idea. But one thing I will say from some of the names that I know were on that letter, it wasn't a cohesive group of caucus members where you think that they're from one faction of the party. It really did reach beyond different elements of the party, because Aaron O'Toole had a unprecedented panache to actually alienate all sectors of the party between flip-flops and his aggression towards them. So it's not as cohesive of a group that took him out as the angry Shiarites, as his leadership team tried to push out the night before the vote. It was much more fractured. And when you're down to fewer seats than you were in the previous election, you're looking at only having safe seats. So I don't fault the caucus members for trying to help us get a leader who can grow in the next election.
And, at this time, it's very interesting to see that, the Liberal Party is also having its own issues, not just with all of the protest and Trudeau, but we did see Joël Lightbound, I believe is his name, who had openly criticized sort of the stances of the government, being a bit more apprehensive to continue many of the restrictions that are in place across the country. In terms of how the Liberal Party views this, is it basically, are they just kind of clapping, which is how the initial reaction seemed to be amongst many of the elite, or are they actually fairly worried about what this leadership contest could mean for their stakes in the next election?
Look, they certainly should be unhappy about it. I think, Mr. O'Toole's continued leadership was, in my opinion, good for the Liberal Party, which is one of the reasons why I opposed is the reason why I opposed his continued leadership, because I think it's important to get a Conservative government elected. I've seen a lot of Liberal jubilation over the potential leadership of Pierre Poilievre, who's without a doubt, since Stephen Harper left, has been even though he has served under now 4 leaders, 2 permanent and 2 interim leaders, since Mr. Harper has left. Throughout that time, he has been, in Mr. Harper's absence, the most popular Conservative member of Parliament amongst Conservative members and the Conservative base. And I see a lot of Liberals very jubilant over the prospects of his leadership because I think they think he'd be an easy pushover. That is very foolish. I would not wish Mr. Poilievre to be my opponent in anything, frankly. He is a hard communicator. He is a street fighter. He is a man of principle who will stand up for what he believes in. And if you look at the beginning of the government of Justin Trudeau in 2015, there were 2 rising stars in caucus. One was Chrystia Freeland, who was put into various cabinet portfolios. And frankly, I mean, I see you're shaking your head, but she is still considered the bright light in that caucus. And the other was Bill Morneau, the Bay Street wonder boy, who was just both attractive on every metric and very, very wildly successful. And he was the other one. And as our critics in Parliament, Ms. Freeland faced Erin O'Toole, and she went on to become the great rising star of the government. And Mr. Morneau faced Pierre Poilievre every day, and he is now curled up in a villa that he forgot he owned and didn't disclose. And We is no longer a charity. So I think anyone who wishes Mr. Poilievre as their opponent, their hubris will come back to bite them.
And on that note of Pierre, and this is my own anecdotal experience, but I'm seeing people from across the political spectrum, especially younger people in our kind of demographic, who maybe have never voted conservative, who see these videos on TikTok and Instagram and Twitter, and they go, okay, this guy's actually like on point. He's making, like, I just think of the video of like, what is the government debt? And it's like they can't answer the question. Immediately that resonates with a lot of people because they see that and they go, okay, maybe this guy isn't the ordinary politician that we're used to, especially in the Trudeau era of non-answers and weird platitudes. But I'm curious as to see if you're seeing maybe that groundswell or that broader support beyond the conservative base for someone like Pierre.
On Saturday night when he released his video, which quickly received more views on various social media platforms than a average CFL game, Canadian Football League game, would on a Saturday night, which is incredibly impressive. Just several throughout the various platforms, several millions of impressions. I was enjoying the newly legalized activity in Ontario of dining in a restaurant on Saturday night, and was with some friends, and we were all scrolling through social media, and we were all surprised to see friends from well outside of politics or contacts from well outside of politics, be it people I went to high school with who I've never considered to be politically interested, sharing stuff about Pierre's run with excitement. People, just various professionals who've interacted with who've had never an interest in politics that's been expressed. So I think you're 100% right. I think he actually does reach outside of the political class, which in a leadership for a potential opponent is very daunting.
Could it be that the issue of inflation, which is one that Pierre Poilievre has sort of highlighted over the course of the last few months and has really come to bear here in the last couple of weeks, we've seen from the figures. Do you think that will be one of the sort of leading charges behind a lot of enthusiasm for sort of his leadership, because he was able to hone in on that? He was able to question, the government very early on about it, and it is something that impacts Canadians in every single province, and especially those of the lower economic ladder. Do you think that's sort of the main driving one, or does it have to do more with personality, or are there other issues you think that kind of buoy that?
Look, I think we have to dive into what inflation means to voters. It's obviously very complicated. And, inflation for me, in 2008, when I first noticed it as a young person living at home, was when, the loaf of baguette I started to cost a bit more, because I'm sort of, out of, I'm not your average person. But I think it's something I've seen David talk quite a bit about on social media, about where Pierre's appeal will be. And that's housing prices, because there's no one in Canada. There's very few people, especially in the greater Toronto area and some of the major metropolitan areas throughout the country, who is young, who isn't negatively impacted right now by housing prices. And this is something that both on the inflation side and directly on that policy, Pierre has been talking about. And I think David hit the nail on the head when he identified that as being, I think, a unique selling feature for Pierre. And it's great to see someone in the federal government finally talking about housing prices, frankly, because we see, municipal politicians talk about it, and it's usually, a lot of it is their fault on the supply side, and we see provincial politicians talking about it on some of the taxation side and some of the red tape side in empowering municipalities more. But there's obviously a huge federal component here, and it's not necessarily a tax rebate or a program for first-time buyers. There's other tools. There's actually one tool that they have at their disposal on this. So it's very good to finally see a member of parliament and possibly a candidate for prime minister talk about that issue when others have been so scared to for years, because it's been easier to avoid for them.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree, Michael. It has been a pleasure to have you on Consumer Choice Radio, and we will have to have you back as the leadership race unfolds.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.